Thank you all for coming. My name's Anthony. I have been in the IT industry for about 20 years. I started off as an IT manager for about 10 years and then decided to join the dark side and become a penetration tester about 10 years ago. I'm really happy to be here in Newcastle with you guys at B-Sides Newcastle, as this is where I'm from. I kind of live about 20 minutes away from here. And I set up a company this year called Pentest Consultants, which are also based in Newcastle. So what we're looking to cover today is a little bit about a tool called Responder, what it is, how it works, how an attacker could take advantage of it, what this means for you and your networks, and then an example of it being exploited. The same thing for network address translation. Hopefully you'll all be NAT experts by the end of this slide deck, but we'll talk about what it is, how it works, and how it can be abused by attackers, and ultimately how it can undermine your network segmentation. So, Responder then looks like this. It's a Python tool. It's designed to poison network name resolution, things like net bias name resolution and link local cast name resolution. Hands up if you've ever heard of or used Responder in this room, guys. Hooray! That's good. Now, put your hands back down and hands up again if you've ever used Responder to poison not the network you're connected to, but a different network. Not so many, that's good. And again, with the poisoning networks across the internet, or hosts across the internet, you can kind of do that with Responder too, and we'll get into how that works. So, for those of you who don't know, the way that Responder ultimately works is, if you imagine you've got a network with a couple of clients, a DNS server and a file server, machines don't really use host names, so things like google.com and FilePrint1. They like to work with IP addresses, and so we have a name system which converts those names from the host name into an IP address. The way it usually works is somebody will type into their runbox / FilePrint1, and they'll, as soon as they hit the backslash, or if they click the OK button, what your machine does is it shouts out to the DNS server and it says, hey, where's FilePrint1? And the DNS server says, oh, it's there. It's 10.20.0.5. And that's great. But what happens when that falls down? So say you're like me and you sometimes mistype things. You hit FilePrint12 because you've caught the 2 key at the same time as the 1 key when you've pressed backslash. What happens is your machine broadcasts to the DNS server or sends a message to the DNS server and says, where's FilePrint12? And the DNS server says, don't know what I do. And so what happens normally on most networks, if you haven't secured or made your network more hardened, is your machine will fall back to broadcast name resolution protocols, things like net bias name resolution and link local multicast name resolution. And what it does is effectively it shouts in the network, is anyone FilePrint12? Now what Responder does is it replies to these messages and it says, yeah, that's me. I'm totally FilePrint12. Please send me your credentials. And effectively, that's what Responder does. Now, I wanted to talk about how this would look in a real network, and there's quite a lot going on this. And this is going to help us with talking about network address translation down the road. So there's a lot to kind of go through, but I'll try and get you orientated. This is a high-level diagram for a client's network. We've called them Example Limited. Over here on the left, you've got the client network, where we're imagining that there's an attacker that's plugged a device in, or they've compromised a machine inside of that network, and they're sat alongside other clients inside of that network. Separately, we've got what was green and is now coming out yellow, a servers network, which contains things like your domain controller, maybe a card data server, maybe your IT jump box, that kind of thing. We've also got at the top a firewall, which allows traffic between the networks to some extent and also allows people to connect out to the internet. So those of you who don't know what a firewall is, that's fine. I'll kind of explain the main thing you need to know. But it ultimately doesn't matter whether you've got a BT Home Hub or like a Virgin Media Business firewall, whether you've got a Cisco ASA or a pair of Cisco ASAs, a Sonic Wall UTM, or some kind of virtual next generation AI powered newfangled thing that they've managed to tell you absolutely need. They all ultimately are going to be doing a bunch of stuff, but two of the things that they will be doing hopefully is something called access control lists, which says what machines are allowed to talk to which machines inside of your network. And they'll also do a thing called network address translation, which we'll talk about in a bit of time. So, going back to our example limited network, how would responder work inside of this situation, inside of this network? So you imagine you've got a client, and the client is saying, is anyone here file print 12? It's broadcasting to the network. You've got your attacker laptop there, it's running responder. What it's going to do is it's going to say, that's absolutely me, please connect to me. And when your client connects, the attacker will probably receive a Kerberos or a NetEnt credential, which they can potentially crack and reuse to attack other parts of your network. And hopefully some of you here today may understand that and know that. But what happens if we're not interested in the clients that we're sat alongside? What if the juicy creds are over there on the IT bastion? Or what if we need credentials for the card data environment, which is on a separate network? Or, sometimes, although we do ask for organizations to place us into a representative network, you may have been on a pen test before where you're literally the only one in there. You've been put on your own VLAN and you've got nothing really to monitor and poison. What can we do then? So, in that situation, what you can do is spoof NetBIOS name traffic. And to talk about that, what if I told you that responder can work across subnet? So, how does that exactly work, and how does responder work? Well, if we bring up Wireshark, which is a packet capture tool, and have a look at how it works under the hood, how name resolution works under the hood. Effectively, when a client tries to look for a host name like FilePrint12, it will have a connection coming from its IP, and it will send it to its broadcast name resolution network address. It always uses the same port. It always uses UDP 137.137 for both the source and the destination. And the key thing to remember or to take away is that it uses something called a transaction ID. Now, a transaction ID is a number between 0 and 65,535. And effectively, when a response comes back to the host, what it's looking for is to find out whether that transaction ID matches. If that transaction ID matches, it sees it as being a legitimate response to its request, and it will accept the response. So, the attack is old and has been around a long time, but I don't feel like a lot of pen testers are taking advantage of it or using it. But all the way back in 2016, you had an article released by Stephen Breen from Foxglove Security, and in his write-up of the vulnerability, which happened to be a local privilege escalation vulnerability, he explained that as well as the local privilege escalation vulnerability called Hot Potato, which you might have heard of, there's also scope for a new type of attack, which is the idea of just brute forcing that transaction ID. If we send everything from 0 to 65,535 to a client continuously, then we can poison the name resolution, even if we're throwing those packets across networks. And he theorized that you could probably do this across the internet if it was fast enough. Now, he actually released a tool on GitHub which allows you to do this, which is called Responder with Spoof. I'm not sure how many people downloaded this, but if you have done it and you've used it, you'll probably find that what it will do is cause a denial of service attack on your own network. So what it does is you put in an IP address that you're targeting, and you put your IP address, which is the one that you're trying to spoof, and it will go through from 0 to 65,535, and it will just repeat that and repeat that and repeat that, and effectively it will fill the network with UDP traffic, which is not good. So it has ultimately a problem. Now, the bit of code that's really blurry up there, which you might not be able to make out, involved, what that does is, as mentioned, it loops around, tries all 65,535, and then it tries again, and it tries again, and it tries again. Now, I'm not very good at making Python scripts more efficient, but I do find it quite easy, and a lot of people do, to make something less efficient, make it slower. So if we just take the tool that Stephen Breen released, and we introduce one line of code, we can introduce a sleep into the function that's used to generate those packets. So it will still send all 65,000, but it'll do it a little bit slower, and it'll send about 1 meg per sec instead of your full bandwidth being thrown across the network causing problems. So that's great. So what that means for you, it means that if a machine is compromised on your network or there's an attacker that plugs a device in, they're able to then spoof net bias, name resolution traffic across those networks. So it introduces more and additional targets from a pen tester's perspective. It opens up the ability to spoof those machines that ordinarily you wouldn't ever be seeing any traffic for. Try to press next. So the way the attack would work is once you've added that time sleep into the net bias MBT spam.py, you run the command like this. You specify the interface that you want to use. You specify the target, the machine that you're going after. You specify your IP, and then you specify the name that you're wanting to spoof, and you mash the goal key. And what happens is it generates a lot of traffic, but not as much as before the sleep was introduced, and it throws them across the network. Every single packet has a different transaction ID. Eventually, when the client does try to look up WPAD, so next time they open their browser or the antivirus checks for updates or something like that, it's going to generate a net bias request for WPAD. It does this 3 times, 1 second apart, and if your packets hit at any point during those 3 seconds, it will poison the resolution, and you'll hopefully get something like this come back. So at the top, I've got the spoof spawner, as I've called it, running, which is sending the spoof messages over at 172.17.0.100. I've got my responder running on 10.20.30, completely different network, but yet the credentials get thrown at me for that machine, which is great. And one of the reasons we ask our users to make sure that they've got good, strong, secure passwords is to protect against offline brute force attacks. So you can then try and crack that to reveal the password for the user as Audrey 1986 for this month's advice on the user, which is great. So how do we fix it? Well, a lot of the industry's been messaging for a long time saying that you need to disable broadcast name resolution protocols, things like local multicast name resolution and net bias name resolution. You can push these changes through PowerShell and group policy. More recently, a lot of people are onboarding with Intune. You can potentially create Intune policies to push a PowerShell script that will do this for you. But yeah, turn it off, basically. And apply the principle of least privilege to your firewall rules. So if your users aren't needing to send UDP 137 between networks, don't allow that to happen, effectively. So, in summary, the traffic can be poisoned across subnets. Name resolution should be off, and you should ask your teams whether they've turned it off. And for us as testers, understanding how tools work and what they're doing in the background sometimes opens doors. So it's important to make sure you take the time to learn what's going on under the hood. So some people might say, that's fine, we've got firewalls. They're going to say anything from this sketchy network that we don't trust going towards our shiny trusted network, we're going to just block and we're going to drop all that. So I wanted to talk to you today also about network address translation and how you can potentially abuse that to pivot from one network towards another. So NAT. What is NAT? NAT is my next door neighbor, but also alongside that, it stands for Network Address Translation, and specifically I'm talking about NAT overload here. So the idea of using one public IP address and having many clients behind that IP address. So I want to hopefully bring you all on board and bring you up to speed about how NAT works from a high level. So even if you're not technical, hopefully you should be able to kind of follow this along. But imagine you have one office, and inside that office you have one address for your office. But you want to send parcels out for a lot of different people inside the organization. So imagine we've got a red user up here on the red network. We've got a green user down here on a completely separate green network. And they both have packages that they would like to send out towards the internet. Okay? Now, that's a lot of packages to keep track of, so we're going to need something to do that. And what happens is your reception desk or your firewall produces a network address translation table or whiteboard. Okay? And then what happens is when a message gets sent by a user, the firewall receiving the package logs it within its network address translation table and then yeets it out the door towards the internet to wherever it's going. And when we receive another package come in, we make another network address translation table entry, and we again send that message out the door. Now, when a package comes back from the internet, we've got a decision to make. We need to decide, where is this package going? And what we do is we look at our network address translation table and we say, okay, well, they match. That goes to green. And we send the package to the green user on the green network, which is great. So how do we attack it? And where does it fall down? And how can it undermine our segmentation between our networks? Now, again, a few years ago in 2021, I was sat in the hotel room of a Premier Inn on an IT health check, doing some research into some new attacks that were coming out, and this new thing hit my inbox called Frag Attack, which was a wireless network exploit which allowed you to inject packets, single packets, into wireless networks, even if you didn't know what the WPA3 password was. And that was very scary. But it was implementation specific, and it depended on the wireless access point that you were using, and it was patchable and all the rest of it. What the tester did, a guy called Matti Vanu, he created a YouTube video where he explained how his attack worked, and he did two things. He injected a single packet onto the network which switched on a light. So he explained, if your organization has like one of those Internet of Things smart plugs, sometimes they don't have authentication on them, and he was able to demonstrate, hey, what if we inject a single packet onto the network and it's the control packet for switch this light on. He did that, which was great. But the next thing he did, which I found really interesting, was he sent a single packet onto the network which went out the network address translation via network address translation, and he then connected back into the network to exploit Bluekeep, which was a RDP vulnerability which was around at the time, very common at the time. Now this freaked me out because I'd seen some research in the past about how you can punch a hole in UDP, you could maybe get somebody to browse your website and somehow then get access to their machine directly. But this kind of changed the way I thought about network address translation when I realized, hang on, he's exploited TCP there. That's really interesting because that becomes, as an attacker, much more useful. So, what this means, if you imagine, back to our network address translation simulation, if you're a red user on the red network and you create a package going to a machine that you control, but you spoof that packet. So yeah, I mean, it's great having a wireless network vulnerability that affects specific implementations of specific wireless access points. Super cool stuff. But break it down even more simple. If you imagine you're already on the network, spoof a packet for the network that you're trying to get to and send that to the firewall. The firewall will create a network address translation entry saying anything coming from this hacker.com goes to the green network. That'll then get sent out to the internet. When you remote into this machine on the internet and control it and connect back, where's the package going to go? It's going to get sent straight back to the green network, which is bad. Basically, you end up with command being sent and received between the green network, which never seen the attacker's machine before, and the attacker controlled host on the internet, which is a very scary thought. Even if your organization has a firewall that says red network is not allowed to talk to green network, now the attacker's talking to the green network through the link that's been created, which is really bad. So how does this look on our example limited, and how would this look on a real network? So what happens is we need a network address translation table created up in the corner there, and we sit on our 10.20.30.123 address, which we're not interested in, but we spoof a packet of 172.17.0.102. So we're spoofing a packet of this card data controller over here. We choose a destination, which is an IP that we control, and we pick any port, and it can literally be any port. So if I'm targeting a domain controller, I might pick DNS. But yeah, we pick a port, And that goes to the firewall, and the firewall creates an entry in its network address translation table that says, hey, if I see any packets coming back from port 8080 on that internet IP, it needs to go back to this machine over here. The message gets sent out and goes over to the attacker. The attacker then sees the public IP for the network that's connecting out and reaching out, and it sees a random port that's been generated by the network address translation function of the firewall. It knows that it's connecting on port 8080, so what it needs to do is just do the reverse of this. When it sends its message back, it picks a source of itself, it picks the source of the port that it was coming from, and it targets the public IP belonging to this network and the port. Because everything matches and marries up when it comes back to the firewall, it follows its rule in its network address translation table, and it throws the packet over the card data machine, which is really, really bad. Effectively, you have communication from an internet host directly to one of your internal hosts, which is a very scary concept. Now, you may have a rule that says, we do not allow things on the internet to connect directly to our card data server. That's just madness. We'd never allow that. But that's not that's not what the firewall saw. What the firewall saw was that your card data server attempted to make an outbound connection towards the internet. If you've got a firewall rule that allows that, then it's going to pass its access control checks and it's going to throw it out the door. So, we've got a command and control between these two machines, and going back to what really freaked me out when I first saw this attack and kind of understood what was going on, I thought, well, what if this isn't kind of like clients and servers? Like, what if this is a client range and a card data environment? What if this is a client network and operation technology? If you've got some kind of clawing control system, that's going to be a nightmare. Students and staff, if you're in education, or the one that really worried me the most, guest wireless internet and your internal net. If you've got the same firewall used between these two systems, yes, you may have rules that say guest Wi-Fi is not allowed towards our internal. You may be falling foul of this, and it's going to be kind of causing you problems. So I thought, let's give an example for the testers in the room. And this is going to get a little bit more complicated now. But we're going to be talking about attacking the SMB service. So SMB is what Windows uses for file sharing. It can be used to execute commands remotely on machines. It's a very interesting service, and it's a TCP service, and we have tools already that work with the service. So I thought, let's try and see how we can exploit that, and let's see what the problems are going to be when we try and exploit that. So I created a little Python script using Scapy that generated packets. So all it does is it creates I put in an IP address that I want to be targeting on the network, and I put in my IP address for my VPS server on the internet, and I put port 8080 in, or whatever port I want to use, and I run the Python script. And what it does is it just generates that one packet and places it on the network. What happens is that that packet ends up appearing from the client's public IP, and it goes to my IP address out on the internet. The source port is random, picked randomly by the firewall as it creates its NAT entry, and the destination port is the port that I'm expecting, which is 8080. Now, the first problem that I'm going to hit is that I don't have a service running on port 8080 on my machine at the moment. So my machine is going to create a reset packet. And when that reset packet's set back to the firewall, it's going to decide, okay, we're not doing anything with this connection. We're just going to bin it off, and it'll close it down. So problem one, or solution one for problem one, use IP tables or something to drop those reset packets. Don't let them leave your machine. Okay? That's that fix. Right. Next step. So we produce the packet, and it goes out from the client to my control machine on the internet. Port's changed. That's fine. But I need a way of sending a message back. And the message that I send back has to have a source port of whatever that firewall came up with, okay? If it doesn't, it's not going to match that NAT rule, and it's just going to get dropped by the firewall. So you'll find that when you use tools like Crackback Exec, NetExec, they do not have the ability to set a source port, okay? If you check the kind of help, regret for port, there's no option to say, I want all this traffic to come from port 47637. So solution 2 is to stick something in the middle of the tool you're trying to use, CrackMac exec, and the your machine, which is about to create that packet and send the connection back. So we use SOCAT to do that. SOCAT, we can create a listener on our machine. We can set it to our local IP address on the virtual private server that we're controlling. And we can then specify the target's public IP, the port that we know we need to use, and we can say that the source port needs to be port 8080 there. So we're targeting port 47637 as a destination, but the source port needs to match the one that the client tried to hit. And that's great. You'll do that, and then you'll find that netexec still doesn't work. And the problem is that netexec is quite yappy, or CrackMac exec if you've ever used that. It creates multiple connections, okay? It does one to check whether SMB signing switched on. It does a separate one to decide whether it's using SMB version 2 or SMB version 3, or whether it's using SMB version 1. It basically produces a number of connections outbound, and unfortunately for the tester or for the attacker, you only have the one opportunity. You've created your spoof packet, you get to reply to that spoof packet, and as soon as that communication's dropped and finished, you then need to spoof more packets. So you can absolutely spoof more packets, that can be a thing. But a solution to this with SMB would be to use something like NTLM Relay X with its SOCKS mode. So if you've not seen this, NTLM Relay X has a really handy ability to create a single connection using SMB and create a SOCKS proxy which you can then loop into and send you multiple connections. So we get NTLM Relay X started, and we tell it to listen to localhost, and we target our SOCAT connection that we set up earlier. We then authenticate against the SMB service that we've created. So we SSH into our VPS and forward 445, and then we authenticate against that 445. If you follow those steps end to end, effectively you'll end up with something like this saying, hey, give me the password. You put the password in, and you'll receive a message saying the attack succeeded and a SOCKS tunnel is now created. You can then send multiple requests through that SOCKS port to then do what it is that you want to do against that SMB service. So in this case, as an example, I've authenticated, I found I'm an admin, I've then run a command, I found out that I'm NT authority system, and then I've dropped some hashes just to demonstrate that I'm doing multiple things. Long story short, if you're trying to do this, remember that you'll only have the one opportunity, so you either need to create something that sends multiple spoofs and you hop off the back of that, or you need to create some kind of middleware or use something like NTLM Relay X to sit in the middle. So from the machine's perspective, the server's perspective, this looks really freaky. If you imagine you're a domain controller and you just sat there minding your own business, protected in the internal network, all of a sudden a wild packet appears that does say, I promise you, the external IP for the attacker. So this SMB service just kind of appears out of nowhere, and the connection then just carries on and works up until that connection's been dropped. So, what does this mean, and what's the impact to you as an organization? What I'm trying to tell you, what I'm trying to put across here is, instead of connecting directly from that untrusted network into that trusted network, if you're happy to kind of leave the network and go out to the internet and come back, you can absolutely bypass network segmentation and access those protected internal networks. This could be combined with the talk that I mentioned earlier about NetBIOS name resolution service. So there's nothing stopping you doing this multiple times. You could land into the client network, you could spoof UDP and try and get something to connect back to you. So poison the name resolution using NetBIOS name resolution. And then once you've got the credentials, you can then spoof TCP and link yourself back in that way and combine the two, which is a very scary thought. So how do we fix it? Now, if you log into your firewall, you will have likely something called anti-spoofing, or you'll have something called unicast reverse path forwarding, which is a very clever solution. What unicast reverse path forwarding does is for every packet that arrives on an interface, the firewall looks at its routing table and it decides, could I reach that from here? And if it can't reach it from there, it just drops the packet, which is great. Now, when I do firewall reviews for organizations, I find that this is switched on very often. However, for most organizations, and possibly just by default out of the box, it's only switched on for the external internet interface. You guys need to enable this for your internal network interfaces, or at least for that guest wireless network interface and that kind of thing. The other thing that you can do to solve the problem is you can add even more firewalls into the solution. So if you had a firewall here on the edge of the network that you're trying to protect, this firewall here is going to have its own network address translation table. And so me spoofing and creating a network address entry on here, when that packet comes back, this firewall is not going to have heard of that connection before, and it's not going to let it through. So that would be a good way to resolve the issue. Another thing to consider as well is to take a look at your kind of, what I call your defense in depth. So install more submarines and build more underwater castles, whatever phrase you want to do. But look at your wider picture. Do your users have good, strong passwords to make it hard for the attackers to crack those passwords in an offline attack? Have you got specific restricted outbound network firewall rules that restrict the ability for that card data server to go out to the internet in the first place? Those will ultimately help. So in summary, network address translation can kind of undermine any expected network segmentation controls. Attacks against your broadcast name resolution are still valid today. Responders have been around for a very long time, and I still use it in a penetration test that I'm doing nowadays, more recently. But I'll be doing the spoofing thing more than the name resolution thing. And as testers, it's important really for us to, when we receive these kind of alerts saying, hey, there's a new tool, or hey, there's a new attack against specific wireless implementations, it's always good to kind of spend a little bit of time reading about how those attacks work and what the tool's actually doing under the hood, because that can sometimes make you imagine or think about a different way or a different method that you're able to implement to abuse that vulnerability that's being described. If you guys have any kind of questions, I don't know how much time we've got now, because I know that hit about 28 minutes when I've been rehearsing it. Please catch me outside or drop me an email or a LinkedIn message or something like that. But yeah, have we got any time for any questions? Okay, yeah, so we're good. That's it. That's your info.